The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the kitchen table where I sat, staring at the stack of papers before me. Divorce papers. The very thought of them sent a shiver down my spine, a mix of fear and anticipation swirling inside me like a storm. George stood across from me, his gaze cold and calculating. He expected me to beg, to plead for him to take me back like I had done countless times before. But not tonight. Tonight was different. Tonight I had made up my mind. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the pen. I could feel George's eyes boring into me, his presence suffocating. But I refused to let him intimidate me any longer. With each stroke of the pen, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a sense of freedom washing over me like a tidal wave. As I handed the papers back to George, his expression remained unreadable. "Is this what you really want, Nicole?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. I met his gaze head-on, my resolve unwavering. "Yes, George. It's what I want," I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside me. He scoffed, his disbelief palpable. "You'll regret this, Nicole. You'll come crawling back to me, begging for forgiveness." But I refused to let his words affect me. I had spent too long trapped in his web of lies and manipulation, too long living in fear of what he might do to me. It was time to break free, to reclaim my life and my sanity. Without another word, I turned on my heel and headed for the door, leaving George behind me in the darkness of the kitchen. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, I knew that I had made the right decision. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but I was ready to face it head-on. The days following the signing of the divorce papers were a whirlwind of emotions for me. Relief mingled with uncertainty as I navigated the aftermath of my decision to leave George. But amidst the turmoil, one thing became increasingly clear. George's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack, revealing the darkness lurking beneath. As I went about my daily routines, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being constantly monitored by George's unseen presence. His abuse had left me feeling isolated and alone, cut off from the world outside our home. But now, with the prospect of freedom on the horizon, I began to see through his lies. I reached out to old friends, tentative at first, but gradually growing more confident with each conversation. Their reactions were a mixture of shock and concern. Their disbelief mirrored my own. How had I let George's manipulation blind me for so long? But as the truth began to emerge, so too did a sense of empowerment. I was no longer the helpless victim trapped in George's web of deceit. I was a survivor, reclaiming control over my own life one step at a time. One afternoon, as I sat sipping tea in my newly liberated kitchen, the doorbell rang, startling me out of my reverie. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before steeling myself and crossing the threshold. To my surprise, it was Mrs. Jenkins from next door, her face etched with concern. "Nicole, dear, are you all right?" she asked, her voice soft with worry. I forced a smile, masking the turmoil roiling inside me. "I'm fine, Mrs. Jenkins, just getting used to being on my own again," I replied, my words sounding hollow even to my own ears. But Mrs. Jenkins wasn't convinced. She reached out and took my hand, her touch warm and comforting. "You don't have to pretend with me, Nicole. I've seen the way George treats you, heard the arguments late at night. You deserve so much better than that." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes as I realized that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. Mrs. Jenkins had been watching over me all along, a silent guardian in the midst of my darkest days. As she enveloped me in a gentle embrace, I felt a sense of belonging wash over me, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. George's facade may have fooled the world, but it could never extinguish the light of truth that burned within me. and with that realization, I knew that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. The letter from my long-lost father arrived unexpectedly, tucked between bills and junk mail in the mailbox. I stared at it for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my chest as I traced the familiar handwriting on the envelope. It had been years since we last spoke, since our relationship had fractured beyond repair. But now, faced with the prospect of starting my life anew, I longed for his support and understanding. With trembling hands, I tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. The words blurred together as tears filled my eyes, my father's voice echoing in my mind as I read his heartfelt words of apology and reconciliation. He had heard about my divorce and wanted to reconnect, to make up for lost time. I felt a mixture of emotions swirling inside me: disbelief, hope, and a longing for the father-daughter bond that had been shattered by years of estrangement. Could I trust him again after all that had happened between us? But deep down, I knew that I needed him in my life now more than ever. With George out of the picture, I was adrift, searching for an anchor to hold on to in the stormy seas of uncertainty. We arranged to meet for lunch at a small cafe downtown, the tension palpable between us as we exchanged hesitant smiles and awkward pleasantries. It felt surreal to be sitting across from the man who had once been a stranger to me, yet who shared the same blood coursing through my veins. For a while, the conversation remained stilted, the silence punctuated only by the clinking of silverware and the murmurs of other patrons. But gradually, as we shared stories and reminisced about old times, the barriers between us began to crumble, replaced by a sense of familiarity and understanding. "So, Nicole, how have you been?" my father asked, his voice gentle yet tinged with regret. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to reveal. But then, looking into his eyes, I saw the same pain and longing reflected back at me, and I knew that I could trust him with the truth. "It's been tough, Dad," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "George, he wasn't who I thought he was. He hurt me in ways that I can't even begin to describe." My father reached across the table and took my hand in his touch warm and reassuring. "I'm so sorry, Nicole. I should have been there for you, should have protected you from harm. But I promise you, from this day forward, I will do everything in my power to make things right." Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized that I wasn't alone anymore, that I had found an ally in my father. And as we sat there, surrounded by the hustle and bustle of the busy cafe, I knew that this was just the beginning of a journey that would lead us back to each other, stronger and more united than ever before. With my father by my side, I felt a newfound sense of strength and determination. He had reached out to me in my darkest hour, offering support and understanding when I needed it most. And now, as we faced the daunting task of confronting George about his mistreatment of me, I knew that I couldn't do it alone. But my father wasn't the only one who wanted to help. My ex-father-in-law, George's own father, had also reached out to me with an offer of support. He had seen the way his son treated me, the pain and suffering he had caused, and was appalled by his behavior. Together, the two men formed an unlikely alliance, united in their desire to hold George accountable for his actions. As we sat around the kitchen table, the air heavy with tension, my father and ex-father-in-law exchanged wary glances. They had once been on opposite sides of the fence, their relationship strained by years of resentment and bitterness. But now, faced with a common enemy, they were willing to put aside their differences for the greater good. "We need to confront George about what he's done," my father said, his voice firm and resolute. "He needs to understand the pain and suffering he's caused, not just to Nicole, but to everyone around him." My ex-father-in-law nodded in agreement, his expression grim. "I've seen the way he treats Nicole, the way he belittles and demeans her. It's not right, and it's not fair. He needs to be held accountable for his actions." I felt a surge of gratitude towards these two men, these unlikely allies who had come to my aid when I needed them most. With their support, I knew that I could finally confront George and put an end to his reign of terror once and for all. As we made plans to confront George at his office the following day, I felt a sense of nervous anticipation building inside me. This would be the moment of truth, the moment when George would finally be forced to face the consequences of his actions. And with my father and ex-father-in-law by my side, I knew that I wouldn't have to face it alone. The morning of the confrontation with George dawned with a sense of urgency and determination. My father, my ex-father-in-law, and I met outside George's office building, our nerves tingling with anticipation. We had rehearsed what we would say a dozen times over, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease gnawing at my stomach. As we entered the sleek, glass-fronted building, the receptionist greeted us with a polite smile, oblivious to the storm brewing inside. We made our way to the elevator, the silence between us heavy with unspoken tension. When we reached George's floor, I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. With each step towards his office, my heart pounded in my chest, the sound echoing in my ears like a drumbeat. As we entered the spacious corner office, George looked up from his desk, his expression a mixture of surprise and irritation. "What are you doing here, Nicole?" he demanded, his voice dripping with disdain. I squared my shoulders, meeting his gaze head-on. "We need to talk, George," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor of fear coursing through me. My father stepped forward, his face a mask of determination. "You've hurt Nicole in ways that you can't even begin to imagine, George. It's time for you to own up to your actions and face the consequences." George scoffed, his arrogance undiminished. "And who are you to judge me, old man? You weren't there when Nicole needed you most. You abandoned her, just like everyone else." My ex-father-in-law bristled at the insult, his fists clenched at his sides. "I may not have been there in the past, but I'm here now. And I won't stand by and watch you destroy my daughter any longer." The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with animosity and resentment. But amidst the chaos, a sense of clarity began to emerge. George's facade was crumbling, his carefully constructed lies exposed for all to see. As we laid out our accusations against him, George's defiance wavered, his expression shifting from anger to uncertainty. He tried to deflect and deny, but we wouldn't be silenced. We had the evidence, the witnesses, to prove what he had done to me. And as the truth came to light, George's facade shattered completely. He sat there, his shoulders slumped in defeat, as the weight of his actions finally caught up with him. He had pushed me too far, hurt me too deeply, and now he would have to face the consequences. As we left his office, the sense of relief was palpable. We had confronted George and held him accountable for his actions. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, I knew that I wouldn't have to face it alone. With my father and ex-father-in-law by my side, I was ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. In the aftermath of the confrontation, George's downfall was swift and merciless. The truth had been laid bare for all to see, his facade of respectability crumbling like a house of cards in the face of overwhelming evidence. As news of his actions spread, George's carefully cultivated image as a pillar of the community began to unravel. Business partners distanced themselves, friends turned their backs, and the whispers of scandal grew louder with each passing day. I watched from the sidelines as George's empire crumbled around him, a sense of vindication mingling with a twinge of sadness. Despite everything he had done to me, a part of me couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the man who had once been my husband. But any sympathy I may have felt was outweighed by a sense of relief that I was finally free from George's tyranny, that I could begin to rebuild my life without the shadow of his abuse looming over me. One afternoon, as I sat in my newly renovated living room, sipping tea and watching the sunset through the window, the doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before crossing the room to answer it. To my surprise, it was my father, a worried look etched on his face. "Nicole, have you seen the news?" he asked, his voice urgent. I shook my head, confused by the concern in his voice. "No, I haven't. What's going on?" My father reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "It's George. He's been arrested for fraud and embezzlement. They're saying he could be facing serious jail time." I felt a surge of emotions wash over me, shock, disbelief, and a strange sense of satisfaction. Despite everything he had done to me, I never would have wished this fate upon George. But now, as I watched him face the consequences of his actions, I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice had been served. As my father wrapped me in a comforting embrace, I knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter in my life. George may have been the villain of my story, but I refused to let him define me any longer. With my father by my side, I was ready to embrace whatever the future held, knowing that I was stronger and more resilient than I had ever thought possible. In the wake of George's downfall, a profound sense of relief washed over me like a soothing balm. For years, I had been trapped in a nightmare of abuse and manipulation, my every move dictated by George's cruel whims. But now, with him out of my life for good, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders, leaving me free to breathe again. As I settled into my new life, the days seemed brighter, the air fresher. I spent hours basking in the simple pleasures that had been denied to me for so long, taking long walks in the park, indulging in my favorite hobbies, and reconnecting with friends and family who had been pushed aside during my tumultuous marriage. One evening, as I sat on the porch swing, sipping a glass of wine and watching the sun sink below the horizon, my father joined me, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You seem happier, Nicole," he remarked, his voice soft with approval. I nodded, a sense of contentment settling over me like a warm blanket. "I am, Dad. For the first time in years, I feel like myself again. Like I can finally breathe." My father reached out and squeezed my hand, his touch reassuring. "I'm glad to hear that, sweetheart. You deserve nothing less than happiness and peace." And as we sat there together, watching the stars twinkle in the night sky, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be, surrounded by love and support, and free to live my life on my own terms. George's reign of terror may have left scars, but it had also taught me the true meaning of resilience and strength. And with that knowledge in my heart, I was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that I would never have to face them alone. With the weight of George's abuse lifted from my shoulders, I found myself standing on the threshold of a new beginning. It was a daunting prospect, rebuilding my life from the ashes of the past, but I was determined to seize the opportunity with both hands. My days were filled with small victories and newfound freedoms, from choosing what to wear without fear of judgment, to making decisions about my own future without George's interference. Each step forward felt like a triumph, a testament to my newfound independence and resilience. As I threw myself into the process of rebuilding, I found solace in the unwavering support of my loved ones. My father and ex-father-in-law stood by my side, offering encouragement and guidance as I navigated the uncertain waters of post-divorce life. One afternoon, as we gathered for a family barbecue in my backyard, my father pulled me aside, a knowing look in his eyes. "You're doing great, Nicole," he said, his voice filled with pride. "I know it hasn't been easy, but you're handling it with grace and strength." I smiled, grateful for his words of encouragement. "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you." He wrapped me in a warm embrace, his presence a comforting reminder that I was never alone. "We're in this together, sweetheart. Whatever you need, I'll be there for you." And as we rejoined the festivities, surrounded by laughter and love, I knew that I was on the right path. The road ahead might be long and winding, but with my family by my side, I was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that I was stronger and more resilient than I had ever thought possible. With each passing day, I felt the tendrils of independence wrapping around me like a warm embrace. The scars of George's abuse were still raw, but I refused to let them define me any longer. I was determined to carve out a new path for myself, one filled with freedom, self-discovery, and endless possibilities. As I embraced my newfound independence, I found myself stepping out of my comfort zone and exploring new opportunities. I enrolled in classes, pursued hobbies I had long neglected, and surrounded myself with people who lifted me up rather than tearing me down. One evening, as I sat on the porch, savoring the quiet stillness of the night, my father joined me, a proud smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You've come a long way, Nickel," he remarked, his voice tinged with admiration. I nodded, a sense of satisfaction settling over me like a warm blanket. "I have, Dad, and I couldn't have done it without your support." He squeezed my hand, his touch grounding. "You've always had the strength inside you, Nickel. You just needed to find it for yourself." As we sat there together, watching the stars twinkle in the night sky, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The journey to independence had been long and arduous, filled with twists and turns, but it had been worth it. I was no longer the broken woman George had tried to mold me into. I was strong, resilient, and fiercely independent. And as I took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp night air, I knew that the future held endless possibilities for me. With my newfound independence as my guiding light, I was ready to embrace whatever adventures lay ahead, knowing that I was capable of overcoming anything life threw my way.